This is the reason universal basic income might never work in America, and it has nothing to do with whether we can afford it. Between 2020 and 2022, somewhere between $100 billion and $135 billion disappeared from unemployment insurance programs through fraud. Not errors or overpayments, but organized theft by criminal enterprises operating from China, Russia, Nigeria, and Romania. These networks drained American benefit systems because nobody could answer one simple question: is this person actually who they claim to be? Now scale that problem up. A standard universal basic income proposal sends $1,000 per month to every American adult, which adds up to roughly $3 trillion annually, about 75% of total federal expenditures. Apply pandemic-era fraud rates to that figure, and losses could hit $300 to $450 billion every single year. What we are examining today is the technical and political challenge that will determine whether universal basic income succeeds or fails, making sure one person receives exactly one payment, no more and no less. The fundamental problem. Here is the uncomfortable truth about American identity verification. No secure universal system exists. The Social Security number came into being in 1936 to track earnings for retirement benefits, and nobody designing it imagined it would become the key to everything from bank accounts to government benefits. Countless data breaches have compromised these numbers, yet they remain the standard, and that creates an opening for synthetic identity fraud, which is now the fastest growing threat to government payment systems. The mechanics work like this. Criminals take real Social Security numbers, often stolen from children or deceased individuals or immigrants, then combine them with fabricated names and birth dates to build entirely fictional people. These synthetic identities pass initial verification checks, spend months or even years building credit histories, then claim benefits and vanish. $20 billion in losses from synthetic identity fraud is what the Federal Reserve estimated for 2020, and by 2023, that figure had climbed past $35 billion. Children face the greatest vulnerability here. Carnegie Mellon's Scilab found that children's Social Security numbers are 51 times more likely to be exploited for synthetic identity fraud than those of adults, and roughly 11% of American children may already have a fake identity attached to their number. Every one of those synthetic people could theoretically claim universal basic income payments with no real person ever noticing. Ghost beneficiaries present another drain on the system, with payments flowing steadily to people who died years ago. 98 million deceased individuals appear in Social Security Administration death records. Yet, Government Accountability Office audits keep finding billions going to dead recipients. One audit uncovered $475,000 per month, reaching nearly 6,000 beneficiaries across 4 federal agencies, people the Social Security Administration had clearly listed as deceased. Individual cases show how long this can continue. Raymond Odell collected his mother's Social Security benefits for 23 years following her 1991 death, and by the time investigators caught up with him in 2014, his net worth had reached $4 million, including a Taco Bell franchise funded partly by checks that should have stopped 2 decades earlier. The COVID warning. Understanding what could go wrong with universal basic income means looking at what happened during the pandemic. States faced pressure to disperse unemployment benefits fast, which meant minimal verification, and fraud reached levels nobody anticipated. The Government Accountability Office estimated fraudulent pandemic unemployment payments at between $100 billion and $135 billion, representing 11 to 15% of the $888 billion disbursed, though some private analysts put losses as high as $400 billion. The Department of Labor Inspector General identified $191 billion in potentially improper payments. Recovery efforts have clawed back about $6.8 billion, roughly 5% of the total. This was not desperate people gaming the system. Sophisticated international criminal networks orchestrated these schemes on an industrial scale. A single Minnesota nonprofit, Feeding Our Future, diverted approximately $300 million through fake child nutrition programs. The investigation has charged 78 defendants so far, with connections to fraud exceeding $1 billion. COVID stimulus checks revealed the same weaknesses. 2.2 million payments worth $3.5 billion reached deceased individuals by July 2020 because the Treasury and the IRS chose speed over verification and skipped death record filtering for the first 3 payment batches, which comprise 72% of all economic impact payments. This pattern shows up everywhere you look. Food stamps ran an 11.7% improper payment rate in fiscal year 2023, totaling $10.5 billion on $90 billion in benefits. The Justice Department announced the largest healthcare fraud takedown in history in June 2025, charging 324 defendants with $14.6 billion in intended losses, and a single Brooklyn case alleged $10.6 billion in fraud on its own. Why perception matters more than reality. Public perception of fraud runs consistently higher than actual fraud rates, and when scandals break, the backlash hurts legitimate beneficiaries far more than it catches fraudsters. The welfare queen narrative traces back to Linda Taylor's Chicago fraud case in 1974, which Ronald Reagan amplified during his presidential campaigns. 64% of Americans believed welfare created dependency by 1989, and that perception powered the 1996 welfare reform, replacing aid to families with dependent children with temporary assistance for needy families, complete with work requirements and time limits. Caseloads dropped 56% after that reform passed. Actual poverty fell by 1%. Trust in government sits at dangerous lows right now. Pew Research shows only 16 to 22% of Americans believe the federal government does what is right most of the time, down from 73% in 1958. Half of Americans surveyed by YouGov think benefit fraud is very or somewhat common, but Congressional Research Service data shows only 14 in 10,000 SNAP households contained investigated fraud. COVID unemployment fraud has already ended political careers and damaged others. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz faced sustained criticism over what investigators called catastrophic failure of oversight, and the House Ways and Means Committee labeled pandemic benefit theft, the greatest theft of taxpayer dollars in American history. Other countries show what happens when benefit systems fail spectacularly. Argentina's protests from 2001 to 2002 killed 39 people and forced President De La Rua from office, driven partly by austerity and benefit cuts. Bangladesh lost over 400 citizens in August 2024 protests over government job quotas, and Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina lost power as a result. Kenya's 2024 austerity demonstrations killed 39 people before President Ruto reversed course. A UBI program plagued by fraud scandals would not just hemorrhage money. Political support would collapse, and other social programs might go down with it. Solutions and their trade-offs. Technical solutions to the one-person, one-payment problem exist, but every option involves serious trade-offs. India operates Aadhaar, the world's largest biometric identity system, covering 1.38 billion people. Government figures claim savings equivalent to $41 billion over 15 years from eliminating ghost beneficiaries, with welfare leakage dropping 12.7% in states using digital payments. Independent audits paint a different picture. India's Comptroller and Auditor General examined Aadhaar-based cooking fuel subsidy savings and found them exaggerated by a factor of 13, with falling global petroleum prices responsible for over 90% of the reduction rather than fraud prevention. The human cost looks worse still. Biometric verification fails 12 to 49% of the time, depending on location, with nearly half of beneficiaries in Jharkhand state unable to authenticate. Elderly citizens with aged fingerprints, manual laborers with worn prints, and disabled individuals face systematic exclusion from the system. 42 hunger-related deaths between 2017 and 2018 followed Aadhaar becoming mandatory for welfare programs. And researchers estimated roughly 2 million people denied food rations monthly because of authentication failures. Estonia offers a contrasting approach. Mandatory digital IDs for citizens over 15 have existed since 2002, and 99% of government services now operate online as a result. Annual savings reach an estimated 2% of gross domestic product, equal to Estonia's entire defense budget, while citizens save 5 working days per year through digital signatures alone. Privacy protections come built into the Estonian model, with a data tracker tool showing citizens whenever government agencies access their records. But Estonia rebuilt its institutions from scratch after Soviet rule with just 1.3 million people, and replicating that in America presents very different challenges. November 2025 saw the launch by the Marshall Islands of the world's first nationwide blockchain-based universal basic income, using digital currency backed by United States Treasury bills and delivered through a mobile wallet app. That system replaced one where physical dollars arrived quarterly by shipping container. Scaling blockchain to hundreds of millions of users remains unproven territory. National ID proposals in America run into opposition spanning the political spectrum, from ACLU to the Electronic Frontier Foundation to the Cato Institute. Real ID implementation stretched across 15 years before the May 2025 enforcement deadline, and only about 60% of licenses currently meet compliance standards. Where this leaves us. Universal basic income advocate Scott Santens argues that universality itself shrinks the problem. His position is that we should stop insisting on testing to see who deserves what, provide universally, and use taxes as the admin light test after the fact. He points to the IRS rolling out monthly child tax credit payments successfully, and Social Security's reliable track record of delivering checks. Critics push back on verification, confirming that each recipient is real, living, and eligible rather than a synthetic identity or deceased or claiming across multiple states still requires robust systems. Brookings Institution analysts contend a universal basic income would cost enormously while doing little for inequality, leaving fewer resources for those with the greatest need. The Treasury has made progress on existing programs. Fiscal year 2024 brought enhanced fraud detection that prevented and recovered over $4 billion in fraudulent payments, a 6-fold increase from the previous year. Better Death Records in a pilot program stopped $31 million in payments to deceased individuals over just 5 months. But $4 billion amounts to a rounding error against a $3 trillion program. The $3 trillion question is not whether America can afford universal basic income, but whether we can build systems trustworthy enough to deliver it. Current fraud rates from comparable programs suggest a nationwide UBI could lose between $150 and $450 billion annually. Even at just 1% fraud, $30 billion disappears. And research indicates every dollar lost to fraud actually costs agencies nearly $4 once you factor in detection, investigation, and administrative burden. Fraud has real costs. Estonia proves digital identity can work at scale with minimal fraud and strong privacy protections. India demonstrates that biometrics can reduce leakage, while also excluding the vulnerable populations who need help most. Biometrics can help, and it can harm. America currently has neither system built. Until we create identity infrastructure capable of reliably answering whether this is one real person who has not already received payment, universal basic income remains a $3 trillion gamble on verification systems that have repeatedly failed under pressure. Verification is the core challenge. The pandemic proved we can move money fast. It also proved that speed without verification creates fraud at industrial scale. Any serious UBI proposal needs to solve the one person, one payment question first, because everything else is just math. Speed without checks invites failure.